It was supposed to be another night of war, the kind where nobody survives. The year was 1944, the island was Saipan, and in the thick darkness, a single young Marine crept toward a cave filled with hundreds of enemy soldiers and civilians. He wasn't tall. He wasn't a commander. He was just 18. A kid, really. But what he did next would leave even battle-hardened men speechless. Instead of firing his rifle, he laid it down. And in broken Japanese, he spoke words that would change history. What happened over the next few hours defied every rule of war. One man, alone, convincing over 1,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender peacefully. No trick, no miracle, just courage, empathy, and a voice that refused to hate. This is the unbelievable true story of Guy Gabaldon, the teenager who saved lives instead of taking them, and proved that even in the darkest corners of war, humanity can still shine. If you believe true heroism isn't just about bullets and medals, but about heart, hit that like button right now. Subscribe for more untold stories of real people who changed history, not by destroying lives, but by saving them. And share this story with someone who needs to remember. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to understand, not fight. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of gunfire. Somewhere in the distance, the island of Saipan groaned under the thunder of war. Waves crashed against blackened cliffs, carrying whispers of death through the night. A young Marine crouched in the darkness, his heart pounding in rhythm with distant artillery. 18 years old, 5'4", rifle in hand. Yet somehow, he felt more like a boy than a soldier. He wasn't supposed to be there. His orders were simple. Hold the line. Wait for dawn. But waiting felt impossible when every scream and explosion reminded him how fragile life could be. He'd seen men die in the surf, cut down before their boots even touched the sand. He'd seen faces, young, terrified, vanish beneath the smoke. And something inside him said there had to be another way. His name was Guy Gabaldon, a kid from East Los Angeles who'd grown up speaking street Japanese, raised by a family his country now called the enemy. Life had given him a strange kind of bridge between worlds. That night, as tracer fire lit the jungle canopy, Guy crawled toward a cave his scouts said was filled with Japanese soldiers and civilians. The others called it suicide. He called it a chance. He'd heard the stories. Japanese commanders ordering civilians to die rather than surrender, mothers told to throw their children off cliffs. To them, Americans weren't human. To him, they were simply people who'd been lied to. The cave loomed ahead, a mouth of black stone breathing out fear. Guy could almost feel the eyes watching from inside, desperate, trapped, waiting for the end. He tightened his grip on the rifle, then slowly lowered it. For a long moment, the world was silent, except for the faint hum of insects and the pounding of his own heartbeat. Then, in broken Japanese, he called out softly, his voice trembling but firm. "You're surrounded. You have no chance. But if you come out, you won't be harmed. I promise you'll be treated well. No one will hurt you." His words drifted into the darkness like a fragile thread. Inside there was movement, a shuffle, a murmur, a whisper. Someone shouted, another barked an order. Guy's pulse raced. He imagined fingers tightening on triggers, grenades being readied. Any second, it could all end. He spoke again, louder this time. "There's no honor in dying tonight. You've done your duty. Now live, for your families, for Japan, for peace." His voice cracked, but he didn't care. It was all he had. Minutes passed. Sweat rolled down his face. Then, a sound. Hesitant footsteps echoing from within. Two shadows emerged from the cave entrance, rifles lowered, eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of an American speaking their tongue. Guy stayed perfectly still, his rifle on the ground, palms open. One soldier shouted something, uncertain whether to trust him. The other trembled, glancing back into the darkness. Finally, slowly, they stepped forward. When they reached him, Guy gestured toward the jungle, motioning for them to follow. He kept talking as they walked, reassuring them that surrender didn't mean shame, that mercy still existed amid the madness of war. By the time he reached his unit's lines, dawn had begun to bleed into the horizon. The other Marines stared in disbelief. Guy Gabaldon, the smallest man among them, leading 2 prisoners like ghosts returning from another world. His commanding officer was furious. "You disobeyed orders, Gabaldon! You could have gotten yourself killed!" But even through the anger, there was astonishment. No one had ever captured Japanese soldiers alive, not like this, not one man, and certainly not without a fight. Guy stood at attention, dirt streaked across his face. "Sir," he said quietly, "if I can talk 2 into surrendering, I can talk more. Every one of them that gives up means 1 less body tomorrow." The officer stared, speechless. He wanted to punish the kid for breaking protocol, but deep down, he knew what he'd just witnessed was something extraordinary. A different kind of courage the Marine Corps couldn't train. That night, Guy lay awake under the dim red glow of the camp lanterns. Outside, the jungle whispered like a restless ocean. Somewhere out there were more caves, more frightened souls, more chances to save lives. He wondered what his Japanese foster family would think if they could see him now. The boy they'd fed, taught, and loved, now standing between 2 nations at war, armed not with hate, but with understanding. As sleep finally crept in, Guy knew he would go out again, alone, against orders, into the dark. Because for him, this war wasn't just about victory. It was about proving that even in hell, compassion could survive. And when the next night fell over Saipan, and the jungle came alive with gunfire once more, the smallest Marine on the island disappeared into the shadows, chasing not glory, but humanity itself. Long before the jungles of Saipan, there were the cracked sidewalks of East Los Angeles. Dust hung in the air, and kids played stickball between old cars while mothers called them home before sunset. Guy Gabaldon was one of 7 children in a small Mexican-American family. Their apartment was cramped, walls thin as paper, but laughter always found a way through the hunger and noise. Money was scarce. By age 10, Guy was shining shoes on Skid Row, polishing the boots of strangers who barely noticed him. He learned early that survival meant speaking fast and moving faster. The streets became his first classroom. He learned how to read faces, how to sense danger before it arrived, and how to earn respect without swinging fists. Those lessons would save him later. East LA in the 1930s was a patchwork of cultures: Mexican, Japanese, black, and white, all struggling side by side. Prejudice existed, but so did friendship in the cracks between hardship. One afternoon, Guy met the Nakano twins. They were quiet, polite, and endlessly curious about the fiery boy who joked in Spanglish and refused to back down from anyone. That meeting changed everything. The Nakanos invited Guy home, a small wooden house that smelled of rice and miso. Inside, he felt something new, calm. The family welcomed him as if he'd always belonged there. Day by day, he started learning Japanese words, laughing through mistakes, copying gestures he didn't yet understand. Soon he could bow correctly, say thank you, and even ask for seconds at dinner. At first his friends teased him. "You turning Japanese now?" They laughed. But Guy didn't care. He'd found a second home, one that felt kinder than the broken streets he came from. The Nakano parents saw something special in him, curiosity without judgment. They taught him songs, customs, and the meaning of respect. "Always bow from your heart," Mrs. Nakano would say. "Not from fear." Guy soaked it all in. The food, the language, the laughter that filled the tiny house. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was learning who he wanted to be. When his own family struggled, the Nakanos offered him a bed. What began as friendship became something deeper. Guy moved in, calling them his family, his heart now divided between two cultures. He wasn't aware he was building a bridge between worlds. To him, it was just life. One where tamales and sushi shared the same table, where he could be both Mexican and Japanese at once. On quiet evenings, Mr. Nakano told stories of Japan, cherry blossoms, mountains, and samurai honor. Guy listened, eyes wide, dreaming of places he'd never seen but somehow felt connected to. At 12, he was fluent enough to joke in Japanese. His accent was rough, his grammar messy, but he made people laugh. That laughter became his passport to understanding hearts beyond language. He carried that gift everywhere, into alleys, schools, and later into battlefields. The boy who once sold shine on Skid Row was unknowingly preparing for a moment that would one day save thousands. Those early days in East Los Angeles shaped him in ways he couldn't see then. Poverty taught him grit. Friendship taught him empathy. The streets gave him instincts, and the Nakanos gave him purpose. Long before the world called him a hero, Guy was just a boy learning two truths: that kindness crosses borders, and that sometimes the smallest home can raise the biggest heart. By the time Guy turned 12, he was more than just a guest in the Nakano household. He was family. He woke to the smell of steamed rice, laughter echoing through thin paper walls, and the gentle rhythm of morning prayers. He joined the Nakano children at language school each afternoon. While others played in the streets, Guy traced strange characters on chalkboards, repeating words until they flowed like music from his tongue. His Japanese wasn't perfect, rough, streetwise, and full of slang, but it carried heart. When he spoke, people smiled. He didn't sound like a student, he sounded like someone who cared. The family taught him everything: how to bow correctly, how to eat with chopsticks, how to listen more than he spoke. Every custom, every phrase, was another step across an invisible bridge between worlds. At night, they'd sit on the porch, lanterns glowing softly. Mr. Nakano would talk about Japan's mountains, cherry blossoms, and the sacred idea of honor. Guy listened, enchanted, as if hearing legends from another planet. Sometimes he wondered how strange it was. A Mexican-American boy learning the ways of a culture half a world away. Yet deep down, it didn't feel strange at all. It felt right. He absorbed everything: humility, respect, patience, lessons that no school in East Los Angeles could ever teach. Where the streets had taught him toughness, the Nakanos taught him gentleness. He learned that silence could be powerful, that politeness wasn't weakness, and that dignity lived in small actions. The way you served tea, folded clothes, or offered thanks after a meal. The more he learned, the more he understood that people everywhere wanted the same thing: to be seen, respected, understood. It was a truth that would one day save his life and countless others. When friends from his old neighborhood saw him bowing or speaking Japanese, they called him strange. "You're forgetting who you are," they'd say. But Guy knew he wasn't losing himself. He was growing larger. He didn't see boundaries between being Mexican and Japanese. To him, both cultures were part of the same heartbeat. Family, respect, courage, those weren't Japanese values or Mexican ones. They were human. The Nakano parents treated him like a son, scolding him when he slacked off, praising him when he helped. He called them Otosan and Okasan, father and mother, and meant it with all his heart. He played with the twins, shared secrets, and joined family dinners that blended two worlds: tacos beside rice bowls, laughter in two languages. It was the kind of harmony most adults couldn't imagine. One summer evening, Guy asked Mr. Nakano what honor really meant. The old man smiled and said, "It means living in a way that brings pride to those who love you, even when no one is watching." That line stayed with Guy forever. He didn't know it yet, but it would become his compass, a moral map guiding him through the chaos of a war not yet begun. By 13, he no longer needed translation to understand the jokes, the gestures, or the silences. He could sense emotion behind every word. He didn't just speak Japanese, he felt it. East Los Angeles faded around him. The noise of the streets became background music to a new rhythm of respect and tradition. In a way, he'd found peace before he even knew he was searching for it. Years later, soldiers would call him a hero for what he did with that knowledge. But for now, he was just a boy, quietly discovering that empathy could be its own kind of strength, stronger than any weapon. December 7th, 1941. The radio crackled with news that would change everything. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. Within hours, Guy's world, the one built between two cultures, began to crumble. He was 15, old enough to understand fear but too young to understand hatred. Overnight, the Nakanos, the family who had loved and raised him, were no longer seen as neighbors. They were labeled enemies. He remembered standing on the porch, watching men in suits arrive with papers. They told the Nakanos they had days to pack. They could bring only what they could carry. Everything else, their shop, their home, was gone. Guy felt his chest tighten as soldiers nailed signs to street corners, ordering Japanese families to report to relocation centers. It was the first time he saw the word enemy next to people he loved. He wanted to shout, to tell them it was wrong, that these were Americans just like him. But the world had stopped listening. Fear had replaced reason. Neighbors whispered. Friends looked away. When the Nakanos boarded the buses, Guy stood on the curb holding back tears. He pressed his hand against the glass, trying to smile. The twins waved weakly, their faces pale behind the window. The buses pulled away, leaving behind silence and dust. Guy watched until the last one disappeared. The city felt different now. Colder, emptier, like someone had taken the warmth out of the sun. He walked past their empty house later that week. The garden had wilted. The porch creaked in the wind. Inside, the faint smell of soy sauce and incense still lingered, ghosts of happier days. Guy sat on the steps until dusk, staring at the door he used to open without knocking. "They didn't deserve this," he whispered. It was the first time he felt anger at his own country. The government called it relocation. But everyone knew the truth. These were prison camps behind barbed wire, where families slept in horse stalls and lined up for meals under guard towers. Guy wrote letters, but weeks passed with no reply. He didn't know where the Nakanos had been sent, only that it was far, somewhere cold, somewhere lonely. He prayed they were safe. The world was at war, and every newspaper headline screamed vengeance. Boys his age dreamed of uniforms and medals. But Guy only dreamed of one thing, bringing his family, his two families, back together. He worked odd jobs, saving every cent, feeling lost between two identities. To some, he was too Mexican to be American. To others, too close to the Japanese to be trusted. He belonged nowhere. That loneliness hardened into resolve. If the world couldn't see right from wrong, he would. If fear could destroy everything he loved, maybe courage could build something back. He made himself a silent promise. He would honor the Nakanos, not with anger, but with action. Someday he'd prove that being American wasn't about race or name. It was about heart, loyalty, and the choices you make when no one's watching. The streets of East LA no longer felt like home. Each corner reminded him of something lost. Laughter through sliding doors, the smell of miso soup, the lessons about honor whispered beneath paper lanterns. He didn't know it yet, but this wound, this betrayal of trust, would shape him more than any military training ever could. It planted in him the seed of something unbreakable, compassion in defiance of hate. In the years to come, when Guy faced enemy soldiers on distant islands, he would remember this feeling, the sting of injustice, the ache of separation, and he would choose understanding, even when the world chose war. The war dragged on, and the world felt smaller each day. Headlines screamed of battles across oceans, names of islands no one in East Los Angeles had ever heard before. Guy felt the pull of destiny. By 17, he'd grown restless. The streets no longer challenged him. They only reminded him of the Nakano's absence. He wanted to do something that mattered, something that proved he still believed in America. One morning, he walked past a Marine Corps recruitment poster. A bold slogan read, "First to fight." He stopped, staring at the image of proud soldiers charging through surf, and something inside him clicked. He stepped into the office. The recruiter glanced up. Another skinny teenager, dark-eyed and determined. "Age?" he asked. 17. "Parents' consent?" Guy nodded. He had forged the signature earlier that morning. Nothing would stop him now. When he filled out his forms, one small note caught the recruiter's attention. "Speak some Japanese." The man looked up sharply. "You speak Japanese, son?" Guy hesitated, then said quietly, "Enough to talk to people." Within weeks, he was shipped to Camp Elliott in San Diego, not for standard training, but for language school. While others learned to shoot, Guy studied military Japanese, grammar drills, and cultural briefings. But no classroom could teach what he already knew. He didn't just memorize phrases. He understood the rhythm, the silence, the honor behind each word. That made him more valuable than anyone realized. The instructors quickly noticed. "Where'd you learn this?" one asked. Guy simply said, "Family." He didn't mention the Nakanos or the camp behind barbed wire. Some truths were too painful to explain to strangers. At night, recruits told war stories about killing the enemy. Guy stayed quiet. He wasn't sure how to tell them he'd grown up eating rice balls made by people they now called monsters. He wasn't there to hate. He was there to serve, to protect the ideals America claimed to stand for, even when America itself had forgotten them. That was his silent mission from the start. When boot camp ended, Guy stood a little taller, chest proud beneath the crisp uniform. He'd passed every test, yet the real test waited far beyond the classroom, on islands soaked in blood and fear. He wrote one last letter to the Nakanos before shipping out. "I'll make you proud," he wrote. "I'll fight for a country that will someday understand people like us." He never knew if they received it. The ship bound for the Pacific was crowded with young men barely out of high school. Some laughed nervously, others prayed. Guy stood at the railing, staring at endless water, wondering what waited beyond the horizon. The ocean stretched like eternity. Every wave felt like a question. Could he stay true to himself when surrounded by violence? Could words still matter in a world ruled by bullets and bombs? When the sun dipped below the waves, he thought of the Nakanos again. Their lessons whispered through memory, respect, patience, honor. Maybe those things could survive even in war. Maybe that was why he was going. As the ship neared its destination, officers briefed the troops on the horrors ahead. "The Japanese don't surrender," they warned. "They'd rather die." Guy listened silently, knowing he'd once shared tea with people who bowed, not screamed. He promised himself that if he ever faced the enemy, he'd remember their humanity. No matter what happened, he would not forget the faces behind the uniform. That promise became his armor. By the time the ship reached Saipan, the boy from Skid Row was gone. In his place stood a Marine, small in stature but armed with courage, empathy, and a secret weapon no one understood yet: compassion. The sea around Saipan churned like a living beast, black smoke curling above the horizon. Hundreds of ships crowded the water, their decks bristling with men, weapons, and fear. The invasion was about to begin. Guy stood among them, silent, his helmet tilted low. Around him, Marines joked to hide their nerves, some clutching Lucky Charms, others whispering prayers. Everyone knew what waited beyond those waves, hell itself. When the signal came, the landing craft roared to life. Engines thundered, waves slammed against steel. The air smelled of diesel and salt, mixed with the sharp tang of anticipation and dread. Guy crouched low as the boat surged forward. Explosions lit the horizon like jagged lightning. Ahead, Saipan loomed, palm trees shredded, smoke twisting upward, the beach already littered with burning wreckage. The ramp dropped. "Go!" someone shouted. Bullets tore the water into white spray. Guy leapt forward, boots sinking into wet sand, heart hammering as the world exploded around him in color and sound. He ran without thinking, following the rhythm of survival. Each step felt like borrowed time. Men fell beside him, their shouts swallowed by gunfire. Still he pushed forward, breath ragged, ears ringing. When he finally dove behind a piece of shattered coral, the world narrowed to his heartbeat. He pressed his face into the sand, whispering a quiet thank you to whoever still watched over him. All around, chaos reigned. Artillery screamed from the cliffs, shells burst above palm groves, and machine guns spat fire from hidden caves. The Japanese defenders were relentless, invisible, everywhere at once. The Marines returned fire, inching forward through the carnage. Every foot gained was paid for in blood. Saipan wasn't a battlefield, it was a nightmare stitched into the earth. Guy's job was to scout enemy positions. Crawling through mud and shattered trees, he moved like a ghost, eyes scanning for movement, ears tuned to whispers of danger. He felt the weight of every step. He saw the faces of civilians, terrified, lost, clinging to the edges of war. Mothers shielding their children, old men staring blankly at the horizon. They weren't soldiers. They were victims of orders and fear. That night, under a blood-red sky, Guy huddled in a shallow foxhole. The air trembled with distant explosions. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to one thought. There has to be another way. He thought of the language he knew, the culture he'd lived, the people who had once called him son. Maybe his voice could reach those hiding in the caves better than any weapon could. The next morning, his commanding officer gave him orders to hold position. But Guy's instincts screamed otherwise. He'd seen where the civilians were hiding. He couldn't stand by and let them die. So as darkness fell again, he made a decision that would define him forever. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, slipped into the jungle, and disappeared without a word. The night was alive with danger. Every rustle of leaves could be an ambush, every shadow a sniper. Yet Guy moved with purpose, heart steady, guided by something stronger than fear, understanding. Ahead, he saw the glow of a cave fire and heard hushed voices. He paused, took a deep breath, and began to speak softly in Japanese, the same gentle tone Mrs. Nakano had once used with him. For a moment, silence. Then whispers, movement, hesitation. He knew what they were thinking. Trap. But he kept talking, his words weaving through the darkness like a lifeline. He wasn't lying. He was offering hope. That night, on the shores of Saipan, the smallest marine on the island proved that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it spoke quietly, in a language the world had forgotten how to hear. The jungle of Saipan breathed with danger. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind could mean death. Yet in that deadly stillness, one Marine moved differently, not hunting to kill, but to speak. Guy had already disobeyed orders once. Now, with quiet confidence, he prepared to do it again. He carried his rifle, but his greatest weapon wasn't made of steel. It was his voice. He ventured out under moonlight, shadows stretching like fingers across the jungle floor. The air was heavy with smoke, the scent of gunpowder clinging to his skin. Still, he pressed on, alone. Other Marines called him reckless. Some called him crazy. But Guy saw something they didn't. The flicker of fear in enemy eyes, the shared desperation for survival buried beneath uniforms and flags. When he reached the caves, he could hear the faint sound of crying. Civilians, soldiers, maybe both. He crouched behind a rock, heart pounding, and whispered the words that had saved lives before. "You are surrounded," he said in Japanese, his tone steady but compassionate. "Come out. You will not be harmed. Surrender, and you can see your families again." Silence followed, thick, uncertain, fragile. A shout came from inside, angry, fearful. He waited, listening. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "You have fought bravely. Now is the time to live bravely." The words echoed into the dark like a prayer. Minutes crawled by. Then movement, a soldier stepping into the moonlight, rifle trembling in his hands. Guy didn't raise his own weapon. He simply waited, eyes steady, until the man finally lowered his gun. One became 2, then 5, then a dozen. They emerged slowly, their faces pale, disbelief etched into every line. A single Marine was leading them, not by force, but by faith. When Guy returned to camp with prisoners in tow, the other Marines were speechless. Their laughter faded into awe. "How the hell did you do that?" one asked. Guy just shrugged. "I talked." Word spread fast. The commanders didn't know what to make of it. A private bringing in more captives than entire squads? It sounded impossible, until they saw it happen again and again. They gave him a new title, Lone Wolf. It wasn't official, but everyone knew what it meant. Guy operated alone, slipping past enemy lines with nothing but courage and a handful of words. Each night, he ventured out. Each dawn, he returned with more prisoners. Sometimes 5, sometimes 50. Each one a life spared, a bullet not fired, a tragedy prevented by understanding instead of hate. He carried chocolate bars and cigarettes in his pack, peace offerings. He'd hand them out to those he captured, proving that compassion didn't end where war began. It was his own silent rebellion. But it was never easy. Some nights the caves stayed quiet. Some nights he was shot at, chased, nearly caught. Still, he went back, again and again, risking everything for the chance to save one more. His comrades began to respect him differently, not as the smallest Marine, but as something rare, a man who faced death with empathy instead of anger. In a world gone mad, he was sane. As the weeks passed, Guy's missions grew bolder. He stopped waiting for orders. He stopped asking permission. The war might demand blood, but he had chosen a different kind of victory, one built on mercy. Each sunrise over Saipan reminded him why he fought, not for medals, not for glory, but for the hope that one man could show the world there was still humanity left in war. The legend began quietly, like all miracles do. One morning, Guy returned to camp leading dozens of Japanese prisoners, men, women, even children. The Marines froze, disbelief etched across their mud-streaked faces. At first, they thought it was a trick. No one had ever seen enemy soldiers surrender like that. But as the captives dropped their weapons and bowed their heads, the truth stunned everyone watching. Word spread faster than gunfire. "The kid from East LA brought in another 50, they whispered. "He just walks into the caves and talks them out." Soon, even commanders couldn't ignore what was happening. They called him the Pied Piper of Saipan, a nickname born half from awe, half from confusion. Like the old fairy tale, he seemed to have a strange magic, one that replaced music with mercy. But Guy knew there was no magic in it. It was human connection, simple and raw. He spoke with understanding, not authority. He treated every frightened face as someone's brother, husband, or son. The more success he had, the more dangerous his missions became. Each night he went farther into enemy lines, guided only by moonlight, instinct, and faith that his words could still reach hearts hardened by war. The caves were dark and suffocating, filled with whispers and the metallic scent of fear. He could feel eyes on him, rifles trembling in the shadows. Yet, he always began the same way, softly, patiently, respectfully. He spoke of food, safety, and compassion. "You will not be harmed," he'd promise in halting Japanese. "You have fulfilled your duty. Now go home to your families." Slowly, hope began to outweigh fear. Sometimes he'd hear quiet sobs from within, the sound of exhausted men realizing they could live. Then, one by one, they emerged. Soldiers first, then civilians, mothers clutching babies, elders leaning on canes. The first time he brought back over 100 people, his unit cheered. By the third time, they watched in silence, astonished. This wasn't just bravery anymore. It was something holy, something beyond comprehension. Even battle-hardened officers began to see that what Guy was doing changed the rhythm of war itself. Each surrender meant fewer bullets fired, fewer graves dug, fewer letters home marked, "Killed in action." One senior Marine muttered, "He's doing more for this island than 100 guns." Another said quietly, "He fights with words better than most men fight with weapons." They weren't wrong. By July, Guy's nightly raids had saved hundreds. Then came the night that changed everything, when his courage would cross from remarkable to legendary, when the number of lives he saved would defy belief. After a massive Japanese assault failed, hundreds of soldiers and civilians hid in the coastal caves. The American command prepared for a final assault. Guy begged them to let him try talking first. They hesitated, thinking it madness. But when he stepped into the darkness alone, rifle slung low, they didn't stop him. The line between life and death blurred with every step he took toward that cave. Hours passed. Then, out of the mist, a figure appeared. Guy walking slowly, followed by hundreds of Japanese, their weapons laid on the ground, hands raised in surrender. It looked impossible. It was impossible. 800 men, women, and children, saved by one teenager's courage to speak instead of shoot. The Marines stood frozen, awe spreading through their ranks. The Pied Piper had done it again and more. As the prisoners were led away, medics offered water, food, and bandages. Some of the Japanese wept, bowing deeply to the small Marine who'd given them back their lives. Guy bowed in return. That day, his legend became more than a story whispered through trenches. It became proof that empathy could win where violence failed, that understanding could silence even the roar of war. Guy didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply sat down, exhausted, staring at the horizon. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this was what he was born to do, to fight for peace in the midst of chaos. The battle for Saipan was finally over, but the war had not finished with Guy Gabaldon. He had captured more prisoners than anyone thought possible, yet fate had one more trial waiting for him. When the Marines moved on to nearby Tinian Island, Guy went with them. The heat was suffocating, the jungle thick, but his determination burned brighter than ever. He had found his calling. Word of his exploits had already spread. Officers treated him differently now. Part legend, part mystery. Still, Guy didn't care for praise. He only cared about saving more lives, one night at a time. On Tinian, the Japanese soldiers had heard rumors of the American devil who spoke their language. But when they finally met him, they discovered something stranger, a Marine who offered mercy instead of death. He repeated his mission night after night, calling through caves, coaxing frightened men and women into surrender. Sometimes he returned with a handful, sometimes with dozens, always alive, never defeated. But war always finds a way to remind men of its cruelty. One humid night, as Guy crept through the jungle searching for another hiding group, the darkness erupted in gunfire. Bullets ripped through the trees. Guy felt the searing pain of hot metal tearing into his flesh. He dropped to the ground, pressing his hands against the wounds, breathing through agony and disbelief. He crawled through the mud, dragging himself towards safety as tracer rounds streaked above him. Every inch felt like a lifetime. Still, he refused to cry out. He'd survived too much to stop now. When fellow Marines found him at dawn, he was pale and barely conscious. They carried him to a field hospital where medics worked quickly to stop the bleeding. The pain was excruciating, but Guy didn't complain. The doctors told him his war was over. His body would heal, but he'd never fight again. Guy stared at the ceiling for hours, torn between pride and sorrow. He had saved lives, but couldn't save his own fight. News of his injuries reached command. Officers filed reports, numbers, commendations. But behind every statistic was something deeper. One young Marine who had changed the meaning of courage. When the final count came in, even the generals were stunned. Guy Gabaldon had captured or convinced to surrender more than 1,300 Japanese soldiers and civilians, more than anyone in U.S. military history. He was awarded the Silver Star, later upgraded to the Navy Cross. But many believed it wasn't enough. How could a medal truly measure the bravery of a man who fought with compassion? When Guy came home, he was just 19, a boy who had already lived a lifetime. America welcomed him with parades and questions. Some called him a hero. Others barely knew his name. He smiled politely, posed for photos, but inside he wrestled with quiet frustration. The Medal of Honor had gone to men who killed, not to the one who had convinced the enemy to live. Years passed. The war ended, but Guy never stopped fighting, not on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who doubted that peace could ever be as heroic as war. He told his story wherever he could, not for fame, but for remembrance. "I didn't do it alone," he'd say. "I did it for my brothers, for the Nakanos, for every person who just wanted to go home." The wounds eventually healed, though the scars never faded. Each one reminded him of the cost of peace. That mercy, too, demands a price. And sometimes the bravest hearts are the ones that bleed quietly. Even as decades passed, Guy's fight for recognition continued. He didn't need medals to know his worth, but he wanted future generations to remember that one act of compassion could change the course of history. By the time he grew old, Guy had made peace with his story. He had seen the worst of humanity and answered it with understanding. That, he believed, was the truest honor of all. Years passed, and the world moved on. But the story of Guy Gabaldon refused to fade. It lived quietly in history books, whispered by veterans, and carried in the hearts of those he saved. He had returned home a teenager, yet his eyes carried the weight of an old man. The war had stolen his youth, but it had also given him something rare, a deeper understanding of humanity. In peacetime, Guy struggled to adjust. Civilian life felt slow, ordinary. He worked in factories, fished, sold supplies, always restless. No job could match the purpose he'd found in those nights on Saipan. People wanted to hear about battles and blood, not conversations in the dark. But Guy never changed his story. He talked about compassion, about courage, about the miracle of choosing life over death. Sometimes reporters would ask, "What made you do it?" He'd smile softly and say, "Because I could speak to them, because they deserved a chance to live." His simplicity often left them speechless. In 1957, a television program called This Is Your Life featured him, revealing his story to millions. Across America, viewers sat stunned, realizing that real heroism could sound so humble, so human. The fame didn't last long. Hollywood turned his story into a film, Held to Eternity. It dramatized the events, made him taller, cleaner, larger than life. But Guy didn't mind. He just hoped people listened. He traveled often, visiting schools, veterans' halls, and Japanese communities. Wherever he went, he preached understanding. "Know your neighbor's heart," he'd tell children. "It might save your life someday." Still, one dream haunted him. The Medal of Honor he never received. His friends and supporters petitioned for decades, arguing that prejudice had denied him the recognition he deserved. Guy never spoke bitterly about it. "Medals don't make heroes," he'd say. "Actions do." Yet deep down, he wanted justice, not for himself, but for the message his story carried. He moved to Saipan years later, opening a small tour business. Every morning, he walked the same beaches where he'd once faced death, now lined with palm trees and laughter instead of smoke. Locals greeted him like family. Japanese tourists would bow deeply, thanking him through tears. Many said their parents or grandparents owed their lives to his compassion. Guy always bowed back, humbled and quiet. He died on August 31st, 2006, at 80 years old. They buried him at Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by flags, silence, and gratitude. The boy from East LA had found his place among legends. But Guy's true monument wasn't made of stone or bronze. It lived in the generations born because he chose to talk instead of shoot, lives that rippled outward, touching thousands he never met. Today, his story reminds us that heroism isn't measured in kills, but in compassion. That sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is see the enemy as human. When historians speak of war, they count victories in land and numbers. But Guy Gabaldon's victory was measured in lives saved, a triumph not of power but of heart. He proved that understanding another culture could be stronger than any bullet, that empathy could disarm hatred, and that one person's courage could rewrite the rules of war forever. In a world still divided by language, race, and fear, his legacy shines brighter than ever. A reminder that peace doesn't begin with treaties. It begins with one person daring to care. And so the legend of the small Marine endures, the boy who spoke softly in the heart of war, and through his words taught the world the truest meaning of bravery.